We've seen the rise of utopian socialism and socialist parties that chose to work within the democratic framework of most European nations. However, there was another strain of socialism, predicated on the ideas of Karl Marx, that saw violent revolution to overthrow the bourgeois state as the only true response to what he defined as the exploitation of the industrial working class. These two strains both acknowledged their debt to Marx and Marxism, but divided fundamentally on the means by which socialism was to be achieved. It's for this reason that political organizations as diverse as the North Korean dictatorship of modern times and the British Labour Party can both be identified as socialist, although there are points of convergence that are so few as to be in fact non-existent. Therefore, it's important for us to investigate the roots of Marxist socialism, which are parallel to, but different from, the utopian socialism we discussed in the last lecture. And to accomplish this, we must look at the career and writings of Karl Marx himself and the political organizations that arose in order to activate them. We will also see how the condition of the industrial working class produced different critiques and how the idea of class itself assumed a fundamental role in the vocabulary of European politics and social structure. During the early 19th century in industrial Europe, the working class was increasingly frustrated with the response of the middle and upper class legislators and employers to the reality of their condition. And they began to seek solutions to their problems through the political program of socialism. Socialism in its various manifestations began to serve as a unifying movement for the working class and became the ideological alternative to liberalism for those, even in the middle classes, who wished to find a way of quickly improving the conditions of the poor. Socialism is somewhat difficult to define then. All professed socialists share the belief that within the capitalist system, the ownership of private property, particularly revenue-producing private property, has created economic and social exploitation of other human beings. The means of addressing that problem provide the variables and the differences among the various socialist confessions. Many radical socialists wish to abolish all private property as a means of subverting the competitive and exploitive nature of capitalism as they defined it. Karl Marx is the best representative of this form of socialism, and his influence on Europe and on the world has in fact been extraordinary. Well, who was Karl Marx, and why was he so central to the development of what is often referred to as scientific socialism? Karl Marx was born in Trier in the Rhineland of Germany in 1818, the descendant of a long line of rabbis on both his mother's and his father's side. However, Karl's father became a lawyer and converted to Lutheranism in 1817 and had Karl baptized a Christian at the age of 6. It's interesting that his father chose to convert, but the reason was that he was a lawyer and consequently restricted by the anti-Jewish legislation of the time from working on certain kinds of cases that were very profitable. So he chose to convert rather than to lose that business. And it's also interesting to note, especially given his background, that Karl Marx would eventually become virulently anti-Semitic, a curious development for someone born from long lines of rabbis on both his mother's and his father's side. But even as a youth, Karl showed very, very little sentimentality and respect for those who had helped him. He was taken into the informal salon of a nobleman in Trier, Ludwig von Westphalen, who took the most promising youths of the city and gave them what we now call extracurricular education. Culture, readings, music, things that would help them develop to be part of that cultured elite that the Germans so admired. Well, Marx took advantage of this in many ways, especially marrying his patron's daughter Jenny, much against the wish of her father. And he in fact provided for her really a life of poverty and insecurity as a result of this marriage. But to some extent, even worse was how Marx later consigned the kind old father-in-law who had spent so much time and effort to try and improve the culture of the youth of his city to the dustbin of history. Karl Marx was not a sentimental man. He was, though, a good student. And he entered the University of Bonn in 1836, but soon after moved to the University of Berlin, in fact, after just 1 year. There, Karl became involved in the Romantic movement, and he fell in with a group called the Young Hegelians, a circle of students and some professors influenced by the work of the German philosopher Georg Hegel. Hegel had been professor of philosophy in Berlin until his death, and he died in 1831. Hegel's position is an interesting one, and in fact provided a good deal of material for Marx's own development of ideas, especially his science of history. Hegel argued that human history was the effort to attain the good, and this was the unfolding of God's plan for the world. For Hegel, history was a dialectical process, as it was a progressive idea that was marked by a series of conflicts. For Hegel, each conflict had two contending elements: the thesis, that is the established order of things, and the antithesis, the idea that challenged that old order. And out of this struggle emerged a synthesis, which was not a compromise between the two, not a bit from each, but rather a better solution that included aspects of each, but in fact was something quite different. That synthesis in time would then be broken down into a new thesis and a new antithesis, leading to the creation of a new synthesis. It's a complicated idea and based very much on the traditions of dialectic from Aristotle and medieval thought and medieval scholasticism. But let me give you an example of how this would work from contemporary contexts. The thesis is the statement of the problem. For example, man cannot reach the moon. The antithesis is the challenge to this thesis, usually stating the opposite position. Man will reach the moon. The synthesis, then, is the process of reconciling the problem by using elements from both the thesis and the antithesis to come up with a completely new statement, which would be, man will develop spacecraft to reach the moon. This logical process of Hegel became the source for Marx's later theory of dialectical materialism, as we'll see. And Marx, in fact, was very much dependent upon Hegelian thought in order to develop his own theory of the science of history and the laws of historical change. Well, Marx completed his studies at Berlin in April of 1841, and he began to work immediately on a doctorate in philosophy, which he received from the University of Jena in 1841. The short period of time indicates, in fact, a simple truth. Today it would be seen almost as a purchased degree with little academic rigor or oversight, but nevertheless, he still, however, did receive a doctorate. While working on his doctorate, Marx grew increasingly radical in his thinking. He became an atheist, and he began attacking the Prussian government. He took a job as a journalist, but was forced to leave Prussia for Paris in 1843 because so many of his articles were very, very cogently critical of the royal government in Berlin. It was in Paris that his friendship with Friedrich Engels developed, a friendship that was to last throughout both of their lives. It's interesting how these two men came together. Both Germans, in fact, both of them had been young Hegelians. They both had been influenced by the ideas of Hegel when they were in university, but they hadn't really known one another. They came together in Paris, and they were both from the same middle-class backgrounds, both of them from privileged circumstances, and they became converted to radical revolutionary activity then intellectually, rather than as a result of having suffered any kind of discomfort in life. They were highly privileged, so their revolutionary activity was the result of philosophy and thought rather than action and experience. Engels had been a young Hegelian as well, as I said. The two had met in Germany, but their friendship really blossomed when they met again in Paris. Engels came from an extremely wealthy family of industrialists, and he had developed his socialism, not abstractly completely, but as a result of some of the experience that he had in England when he assumed the management of his family's firm there. He witnessed the horrible working conditions and the living conditions of the laboring poor. He witnessed the callous attitudes of the employers towards their employees. So he himself didn't experience this suffering, but he saw it. Engels exposed these conditions in a rather terrifying book, a book that is in its horrifying detail one of the most effective introductions to the suffering of the industrial working class during the early Industrial Revolution, The Condition of the Working Class in England in 1844. On meeting Marx again in that same year of 1844, Engels became convinced that the strange mishmash of ideas that Marx was collecting and ordering would prove to be the solution to the problems facing the poor and the exploited, that Marx had really come up with the answer. Marx in 1845 was ordered out of France at the request of the Prussian government. Marx was also very critical of the Prussians, even when he was abroad. He then relocated to Belgium, where he and Engels organized the Communist League. This organization was established specifically to spread socialist ideas and to prepare propaganda championing the workers. It was at this time, in the mid-1840s, that Marx's theories on economics and politics began to take clear shape, reaching the conclusion that the study of economics provided the key to understanding the forces of history itself. In fact, Marx became obsessed with the development of a comprehensive, a scientific system. We are in the 19th century and a world of scientific systems that would prove that socialism was the only possible, the necessary product of human society and the result of history. As Kant had sought the laws that govern society in sociology, Marx believed that he had discovered the laws of history. The Communist League recognized Marx's skills and asked him to write a manifesto for their organization. Marx, after all, had been a journalist, and quite a good one. The result was the Communist Manifesto of 1848. It should also be noted that Marx was asked to write this despite the fact he had an impossible personality, and he didn't get along with anyone, really. But nevertheless, the Communist League recognized that Marx had the skills to put their ideas into an effective form, and the result is not one of the most profound works by Marx, but probably the best known, and perhaps because it's the shortest. It called for universal revolution on the part of the workers of Europe against the middle and upper classes in the most polemical of styles. And it very much is the style of a journalist. Workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. The Communist Manifesto proclaimed the inevitable overthrow of the bourgeoisie by the proletariat. Words used in this dramatic way for the first time in Marx's writings. It's ironic and purely coincidental that the Communist Manifesto appeared just 1 month before the outbreak of the revolutions of 1848. The Communist Manifesto had no influence on these events whatsoever. Despite the revolutionary rhetoric of the Communist Manifesto, Marx was not a man of action, but instead he was a man of words. Marx would never be attracted to the barricades armed with guns or bombs. Rather, while others were fighting on those barricades, he would be found in cafes preaching or explicating revolution rather than participating in it. Marx left Belgium after the revolutions of 1848, returning to Cologne in Germany. He then moved back to Paris, where he lived under an alias in order to protect himself in those dangerous years. But eventually, he made his way to London. And it was in London where he would remain for the rest of his life, writing, usually supported by his friend Engels. And again, one of the great ironies of Karl Marx's life is that he lived largely from income from the industrial workers' labor that produced the fortune of the Engels industrial concerns in Barmen and Manchester. A very interesting situation. Marx's philosophy was in fact paid for by the results of capitalism. Engels' support for Marx and his family allowed him to work full-time on the magnum opus Das Kapital, or that is, capital, as in capitalism. In the summer of 1850, Marx, in the British Museum, where he spent much of his time in the reading room, and in fact, in that room, Marx's usual chair is commonly noted. And in that room, he began to undertake research into the capitalist economy. And in Das Kapital, he fully developed these ideas. The first volume didn't appear until 1867, and the second and third weren't printed until after Marx's death in 1883, edited by Engels. And it was a significant work of addition because Engels had to impose both clarity and syntactical discipline on Marx's prose, something that was not easy to do. Capital, Das Kapital, was the closest that Marx ever came to developing his theory of scientific socialism, defined in terms of the Hegelian dialectic, which he had brought with him from Berlin, and from which it differed because he replaced the vision of progression of history towards the ideal state, and interestingly, Hegel identified that ideal state was really the reign of Napoleon Bonaparte, by introducing in its place materialism. So Marx then developed a theory of dialectical materialism, the struggle to attain control over property and the means of production. The critical thing about dialectical materialism is that it is not abstract. Rather, it's driven by the very real forces of economics that are at work in the creation of social classes and in the acquisition of property. According to his theory, dialectical materialism arranges society into economic classes, which struggle through transitional stages in their progress towards ever higher historical development. Marx wrote that human history can be broken down into 5 distinct historical stages. First, before civilizations were established, mankind lived in tribal proto-communism. This, of course, is the world that was imagined by Jean-Jacques Rousseau in The Social Contract as well. But once private property developed, classes began to emerge. The ancient world, the second stage, was a slave economy. This in turn led to the third stage of the feudal world of noble and serf. But eventually feudalism was overthrown by the fourth stage of capitalism, with the bourgeoisie gaining control over the means of production through the growth of industry and the factory system. For Marx, the final stage, that is, communism, had yet to be achieved. Simply, Marx is describing the history of all human society as the history of class struggle, which becomes the engine of historical change. After finishing his first volume of Das Kapital in the mid-1860s, Marx again became curious about the active workers' organizations in Europe, how in fact workers were organizing themselves in order to fight the bourgeoisie and to try and achieve some rights at the expense of the owners of property. So in 1861, Marx traveled to Berlin, and he was extremely impressed with the high degree of class consciousness and solidarity among the industrial workers there. But there was something he didn't like. He didn't like that much of this class consciousness had come from the organizational genius of other leaders who used his ideas and called themselves Marxists. To Karl Marx, only Marx was a Marxist. Marx's ideas had already been widely circulated among radical socialist thinkers. Union and worker organizers in Germany began to employ this vocabulary and this structure of Marxist analysis to build workers' movements that could extend beyond individual industries or areas of the country in order to galvanize the industrial working class altogether and to motivate it for collective political action. Marx returned home to England, and he became superficially involved there as well with a series of meetings between English and French workers, groups that had begun in 1862 that eventually led to the formation of the International Federation of Working Men. This was the first international. This first international asked Marx to write its Declaration of Principles. They remembered his previous contribution to the Communist Manifesto of 1848 and how effective it had been in galvanizing thought and action. And of course, the International still exists to this day, and the communist anthem around the world is entitled L'Internationale, the International. Marx agreed and prepared an inaugural address for the International in 1864. This was enough to establish him as the de facto leader of this first international. However, his difficult, indeed impossible personality and his refusal to recognize the contributions of any others quickly alienated his fellow radicals. He was never to establish himself, in fact, formally within the working class movement after this moment of the First International, and he increasingly became out of touch with active organizations in the years before his death in 1883. This again indicates that Marx was, in essence, a philosopher, a theorist of revolution, rather than an active revolutionary or an active politician. He also was a man of sensitive ego who didn't appreciate being challenged or corrected. In fact, his tendency was to shout down anyone who ever questioned anything that he said. He had no sense of compromise and was completely unsuited to any kind of political role. Even if he hadn't rejected, on principle, the idea of a Marxist political party, no Marxist party could ever have been led by Karl Marx. He was too impossible a human being. Despite Marx's isolation from working class movements in his later life, his theories were in fact being adopted and applied by a number of groups and individuals intent on political action, and also had the organizational ability and the political acumen and the personality that Marx lacked. Among the most influential were the founders of the first Marxist socialist political party in Germany, the Social Democratic Workers' Party, led by Wilhelm Liebknecht and August Bebel. Both men were drawn to Marxist theories as the solution to the conditions of the working classes in Germany. And they built a political party around those ideas. The new party, the first Marxist political party in the world, the Social Democratic Workers' Party of Germany, met in 1869 and eventually merged with other socialist parties in 1875, taking the name of the German Social Democratic Party, a party that exists to this day as a mainstream party in Germany and one that often forms the government. This new party brought together all the German Marxists into a single organization dedicated to political action rather than purely revolutionary rhetoric. The party drew up its program in the German city of Gotha. Marx condemned this platform outright. He wrote in his essay, his critique of the Gotha program in May of 1875, that in fact the very creation of a German social democratic party was not Marxist, because the inclusion of other socialist parties that did not follow his theory would make it un-Marxist. But mostly, he was upset by the German party's decision to work for socialist reforms within the German political system, that is, by contesting seats in the Reichstag. In his critique, Marx wrote that the tacit acceptance of the German Empire, which Marx always referred to as a military despotism, undermined the goal of revolution. And revolution could not be avoided if the Marxist formula for historical change and the formation of a communist state were to be realized. Working with the bourgeoisie, those middle-class reformers with their patronizing compromises, within the institutions of government was not what Marx had in mind at all. From his point of view, and according to his carefully constructed theory, violent revolution was required to take control of the means of production from the hands of the capitalists. This could not be legislated. It had to be done by force. Liebknecht and Bebel, the leaders of the Social Democratic Party, wished indeed to avoid the question of revolution and wished to avoid the dictatorship of the proletariat, that stage that would emerge after the proletariat took the means of production and before there would be the beginning of the communist world, that last stage of historical development. After all, Liebknecht and Bebel were actively engaged in the political process. They were politicians, and they couldn't afford to alienate the nationalist workers, or even worse, to be arrested by the police. You can't do an awful lot of political organizing from jail, and also you can't alienate the very people you are trying to help by telling them that their appreciation of a united Germany that had just come about was in fact contrary to and opposed to their desire to create a socialist utopia. To suggest that the workers overthrow the newly established German Empire would be simple political suicide. Marx refused to accept that industrial workers had any national feeling. And again, once Marx had made up his mind, nothing changed. He believed that their only loyalty would be to their class, regardless where those fellow workers might be. So a German worker had more in common with a French worker or a British worker than with Germany, or a French worker with France, or a British worker with Britain. Liebknecht and Bebel, who actually worked with these people, who actually talked to them and understood that they were connected to, in fact, they were very happy within the German Empire, knew differently. They were proud of and committed to their nation. They were not about to destroy it, even if they saw the need to reform it. It's interesting, and we'll see this with the outbreak of World War I, that Marx's belief that workers have no nation, that they have only identification with their class, will be disproved, because the workers of all of Europe joined the flag and had the same nationalistic obsession as anyone of the middle or upper class. Marx, again, was proved wrong. Consequently, the leaders of the German Social Democratic Party, Liebknecht and Bebel, didn't even bother to reply to Marx's critique of the Gotha program. And they didn't dispute it publicly. They didn't want to have a public debate with Marx. It was counterproductive. In fact, it was pointless. Indeed, what they did is ready the party to compete in the German elections, because, as we remember, the lower house of the new German Empire enjoyed manhood suffrage. In order to co-opt the socialists and the liberals, Bismarck had made manhood suffrage one of the elements for the Reichstag, or lower house of the German parliament. What this meant, of course, and Bismarck was very canny in doing this, workers could, for the first time, cast their ballots for their candidates speaking on their behalf. The consensus was increasingly then that revolution was not necessary because reform was possible through legislation and through legitimate political activity, working through legitimate political parties in order to achieve legitimate ends. You didn't have to overthrow the state. You could change it. You could work within it. You, in fact, could become part of the process. The response of the German socialist politicians then to what they always called the two old men in London, Marx and Engels, reveal the almost total isolation of Marx and Engels from the reality of the political situation in Germany. After 1878, any attempts to soothe Marx's ego were abandoned, because in that year the German Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, began to concentrate an attack, to focus his policy against the German Social Democratic Party. Bismarck's cynical extension of the franchise to manhood suffrage to build liberal and socialist support for the new German Empire had proved far too successful for him. He didn't like what was happening. He had seen the strength of the socialists, and he had seen the strength of the radicalism of their program. And he consequently saw these as threats to the authoritarian and generally conservative paternalistic empire that he was creating. He capitalized on two attempts on the life of the Emperor William I by anarchists as a pretext for an attempt to shut down the Socialist Party altogether. He banned their newspapers and their journals. He tried to stop their meetings in an attempt to neutralize their appeal. These attacks on the socialists meant that the unity of the German Socialist Party and the support of German socialists everywhere within the empire and the protection of the party itself was far more important than working to sustain the theoretical blessings of Karl Marx. Marx, by the 1870s end, had unleashed a political force he could no longer control. It was no longer his. It belonged to his disciples who could take these ideas and apply them in the reality of political life. Marx believed himself to be the only true prophet, and anyone who deviated from his theories was committing heresy. However, as I've said, Marx never operated in the political world, where negotiation and compromise are just as important as ideology. Also, Marx saw, as I said, the very existence of Marxist political parties as self-contradictory. The proletariat could never work within the framework of bourgeois politics. It should at all times be interested only in creating solidarity to bring about violent revolution. Marx died in 1883. Angry and embittered about how he had been treated, and totally unaware of the impact that his work would have on the world. He would be interested, I think, to know that his burial place in London is now a place of pilgrimage for socialists and communists from around the world, coming to pay their respects. I think he would much rather have had the respect of Liebknecht and Bebel during the period of his life, so that he could see his revolutionary desire being fulfilled. That, of course, was not the case. Cells of revolutionary Marxists continued to exist. These were purists, dedicated to Marx's fundamental principle that the overthrow of the state through violent revolution was the only solution to the problems of the industrial working class. This is purist Marxist ideology. The mainstream of late 19th and early 20th century Marxist political action throughout Europe was absorbed by legitimate parties that were modeled on the German Social Democratic Party. These parties ran candidates in elections. They championed a reformist political agenda which called for evolutionary socialist programs gained through the political process and not through the violent overthrow of the state. There still is this bifurcation to this day between the mainstream socialist parties in Europe and the revolutionary activists like the Red Brigade in Italy or the Baader-Meinhof gang in Germany. Marx believed, after all, that he was creating a scientific socialism that was driven by the laws of history that he had discovered. And by identifying the inevitable victory of a proletariat over the bourgeoisie, Marx is very much in the tradition of Darwin and other thinkers who used the model of science as their guide to the future. There were others who used science as an instrument to reach different kinds of conclusions, or who reacted against scientism, who reacted, in fact, against rationalism altogether, because they found these to be insufficient or unfulfilling, insufficient to mediate the complex world in which they lived. The next lecture, we will discuss these individuals and these movements in reactions to rationalism, to see that the dominant Enlightenment mode represented by Darwin and Marx and so many others, in fact, had challengers, and these challengers were to become a very powerful voice by the latter decades of the 19th century.